Welcome to today's Explainer. We're about to step into a really fascinating masterclass on early American history. But listen, we aren't going to be looking at that polished, perfect marble statue version of the past you might be used to. Today we're going to examine the real George Washington. We'll be looking directly at the historical records, his private letters, and the stark physical realities of his everyday life to truly understand the multifaceted and honestly often contradictory man who helped build a nation from the ground up. Okay, let's dive right into this. When you think of George Washington, what actually comes to mind? A stoic commander boldly crossing an icy river? The flawless, ultimate founding father? Well, I want to challenge you today to look completely past that mythology. We're going to explore the private struggles, the profound, deep-seated insecurities, and the literal physical agony that actually shaped this iconic figure. By looking at the primary sources, we get to see a much more relatable human reality. Here is our quick syllabus for today's lesson. First, the insecure scholar. Second, the pain behind the portraits. Third, the economics of slavery. And finally, a complicated final choice. Starting right off with Section 1, the insecure scholar, the self-taught soldier. To really understand Washington the leader, we absolutely have to understand Washington the boy. When George was just 11 years old, his father Augustine died. This abruptly ended his formal education, completely altering the trajectory of his youth. And this is a crucial point because of how much it set him apart from his peers. Unlike his older half-brothers who actually studied over in England, and certainly unlike his highly educated peers, think Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, Washington lacked a classical college degree. He essentially received no more than a grade school education. This stark difference haunted him for his entire life. But it also fueled an incredibly anxious, driven commitment to self-education. Because he felt he always had to compensate, Washington read voraciously. It's like he was on a relentless mission, constantly seeking out the very latest texts on literally everything, from cutting-edge military strategy to modern agricultural techniques. And interestingly, his own lack of formal schooling made him a fierce champion of education for everyone else. Throughout his presidency, he heavily lobbied for a national university, and he even left money in his will to establish free schools for poor and orphan children, plus an academy that would eventually become Washington and Lee University. Moving on to Section 2, the pain behind the portraits, exploring the physical toll. Okay, so the 18th century was a time of, frankly, horrifying medical practices, and Washington's immense public service was carried out while he endured intense, almost constant physical agony that we rarely associate with his super dignified image. First things first, we have to completely dismantle the famous wooden teeth myth. Washington's dentures contained absolutely zero wood. The historical records and the surviving artifacts reveal a much, much more brutal reality. His dentist, John Greenwood, built his dentures using heavy metal fasteners, springs, and materials like brass, lead, gold, hippopotamus ivory, animal teeth, and yes, even human teeth. And Mount Vernon records actually shows some of those teeth were purchased directly from enslaved people. By the time Washington took the presidential oath of office in April 1789, he was in severe, chronic pain. In fact, think about this. He had only one single natural tooth left in his entire mouth. Just one premolar. The primitive, clunky nature of his dentures caused him constant distress and visibly disfigured his mouth, requiring him to rely heavily on laudanum, an opiate, just to manage the daily pain while trying to lead a brand new republic. And this brilliantly illustrates the jarring contrast we're talking about today. On one hand, you have this monumental, heroic public image, like the famous sweeping painting of him crossing the Delaware. But on the other hand, you have the private reality of a man writing desperately to his dentist, complaining that his heavy, spring-loaded dentures were forcing his lips to bulge out unnaturally. That constrained, bulging expression, you can actually see it in his most famous portraits, including the one you probably look at every day on the $1 bill. This immense physical toll culminated in his rather grim final days in December 1799. After inspecting his farms in the freezing rain, he developed a really severe throat infection. And sadly, the standard medical practices of the time arguably sealed his fate. His doctors treated him by administering multiple doses of a highly toxic purgative called calomel, and get this, they drained approximately 5 pints of his blood. Modern medical experts conclude this incredibly extensive bloodletting likely resulted in hypovolemic shock, drastically accelerating his death. Which brings us to Section 3, the economics of slavery, a shifting worldview. We are now transitioning to the most challenging and deeply conflicting aspect of Washington's entire legacy. Washington is universally known as the father of liberty, yet he was simultaneously a man heavily dependent on a colonial plantation economic system that wholly exploited forced labor. During his lifetime, at least 577 enslaved people lived and worked at Mount Vernon. His immense personal wealth, his high social standing, and his entire lifestyle were completely intertwined with this institution. Let's trace how this worldview shifted chronologically, because it didn't stay static. At age 11, he inherits 10 enslaved people. For decades, he simply viewed slavery as a normal economic necessity. But between 1775 and 1783, while commanding the Continental Army, his attitude really began to shift. Fighting a war for liberty while actively treating humans as property presented a stark, undeniable irony. By 1793, he actually went so far as to draft a plan to rent out his lands and pay freed workers, though it's worth noting it was a plan he never executed. Finally, in 1799, he officially mandates manumission in his will. Now, what's really interesting about this detailed 1799 slave census is that it shows his growing doubts weren't solely moral. They were highly practical and economic. As Washington innovated his farming, transitioning the Mount Vernon estate away from tobacco and toward grain crops, he found himself with a massive surplus of labor. This fundamental economic shift made him start questioning the long-term efficiency and the basic financial viability of the plantation slavery system itself. And that leads us to Section 4, a complicated final choice, the will of a founding father. Despite these profound private shifts in his thinking, Washington's public actions as a political leader told a very different story. In his private correspondence, like a very telling 1786 letter, Washington explicitly stated his desire for gradual legislative abolition. Yet, as the first president establishing the norms of the executive office, he remained completely publicly silent. Why? Well, the records strongly suggest a deep political fear. Washington believed the issue of slavery was so incredibly volatile that if he took a public stand or forced the issue, the southern states would secede, literally tearing the fragile new union apart before it could even get off the ground. Because he chose that public silence during his life, he ultimately used his last will and testament to speak for him in death. In these handwritten pages, Washington made the profound legal choice to free the 123 enslaved people he personally owned, a decree set to take effect upon the death of his wife Martha. And he went a bit further, legally ordering that the young were to be taught to read, write, and learn a useful trade until age 25, and that the elderly or sick were to be financially supported by his estate. However, as historians, we have to acknowledge the tragic, very real limitation of this final act. Washington could only legally free the enslaved people he owned outright. He could not legally free the dower slaves, the 153 people who technically belonged to the estate of Martha's first husband. Because the enslaved populations at Mount Vernon had heavily intermarried over the decades, Washington's act of manumission meant that upon Martha's death, many families were inevitably and painfully broken apart forever. So as we wrap up this historical explainer, here is what you should really take away. History is rarely as clean and polished as a marble statue. Today we've seen a man driven by deep insecurity to furiously educate himself, a leader enduring excruciating physical pain behind a stoic public facade, and a founder who secured liberty for a brand new nation while remaining deeply entangled in the economics of human slavery. So I leave you with this to consider. How do we properly study early American history? How do we balance and weigh this iconic figure's monumental public triumphs against his very human flaws, his deep contradictions, and his private failures? Thank you so much for learning with me today.